When summer fishing is over, Bristol Bay fishermen fan out across the country to their off-season homes. Many live in Alaska and Washington state, but the off-season diaspora spans the country from coast to coast and corner to corner. No matter where fishermen are or what their winter projects might be, in late November their collective attention focuses on one thing: the forecast for the next season. This fall's forecast touched off a buzz amongst the fleet like few others. Biologists from the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, ADFG, predict a return of 73.4 million sockeye salmon in Bristol Bay, which would be the biggest run ever, and by a relatively large margin. Sockeye salmon runs in Bristol Bay over the past few years have been, in short, wildly abundant. Biologists have been tabulating the return of salmon in Bristol Bay since the 1880s, and last season's total run of 66.1 million sockeye salmon was the biggest ever recorded. The previous record, that came just 2 years earlier, in 2018, when 62.9 million sockeye surged into the region's 5 major river systems. The fishery has not dipped below the 50 million sockeye mark for 6 straight seasons, and it now appears poised to break the 70 million barrier. The catch might be even more historic. Despite last season's record-setting run, wind, waves, and driving rain complicated fishermen's efforts, keeping the catch at around 42 million sockeye salmon. That's a big number, obviously, but this season ADFG predicts a harvestable surplus of 60 million sockeye. How does that stack up? Well, if fishermen can get all of them, it would be 75% higher than the most recent average of over 34 million fish, and a whopping 170% greater than the average since 1962. And it could be bigger still. With this new regime of bigger runs, ADFG's forecasts have come in low compared to final run totals, to the tune of 22% for the past 5 or 6 seasons, according to Greg Buck, an ADFG biologist who works on the forecasts. Last year, for example, the ADFG prediction was 32% below the actual run. You can bet a few of our fishermen are running the numbers on what 32% more than 73 million might be. Hint: it's not far from 100 million, and many will be looking at the upper end of the error range of the ADFG forecast, which puts its range from 61 to 89.54 million sockeye. However, Buck said for this forecast he and colleagues embraced models that showed a huge run, and thinks this season's forecast will be closer to the final run tally than years past. This year I was kind of betting like it was someone else's paycheck. We seem to be missing something the last couple years, so I'm comfortable with it, Buck said. One of the most important decisions for our fishermen will make during the season is choosing which of the major 4 districts they will fish in. The decision is the subject of endless discussion and hand-wringing, and rightfully so. A bad call can cost a fishing business hundreds of thousands of dollars. To make matters more stressful, if skippers want to switch districts mid-season, that usually means they will be shut down for 48 hours, a potentially costly prospect in a fishery where the peak of the season can be compressed to as little as 10 days. So fishermen will be parsing the district-by-district rundown. Ideally, all districts will get fish, and fishermen can spread out amongst them. This season's forecast looks pretty good on the distribution front. The Neshagak River, a beneficiary of the larger runs, looks to lead the charge again this season with 29.48 million sockeye. This gets a bit complicated. ADFG's summary after last season noted that average weight of the fish harvested was around 4.7 pounds, a pound lighter than the most recent 20-year average. Many thought this meant Bristol Bay fish were getting smaller, but biologists say they're younger, an important distinction. Biologists classify returning salmon by the number of years they spent in freshwater followed by the number of years they spent in the ocean. A 1.2 fish, for example, spent 1 year in freshwater and 2 in the ocean, and it's these 1.2s, a young returning fish, that are driving many of the recent runs. Last season, 1.2 age class made up 60% of the total run. The good news from this forecast is that 1.3 age class fish are set to make 47% of the run, with 1.2s making up the bulk of the rest of the run at Bristol Bay accounts for the largest salmon run in the world, with an average in excess of 30 million sockeye running each year. In the region of Bristol Bay, we fish on the Kvichak River, pronounced Kwi-jak, hence the name. Given the remote geography of Bristol Bay, the canned salmon industry has been a dominating force here since the logistics for moving the product become so much easier in canned form. As processing technologies have developed, that trend has shifted in the last decade. Much of the salmon used to go to Asian markets in cans. Now there is a significant rise in fillet product exported from Bristol Bay to US markets. There are two forms of salmon fishing in Bristol Bay when it comes to the commercial sockeye harvest: set net, which is what Kwi-jak uses, and drift fishing. Both forms of fishing use gill nets, and before we get further into the styles, I want to talk for a moment about gill nets. In many locations, gill netting is frowned upon, and I would wholeheartedly agree. The reason for this is that there are many areas where bycatch, the Columbia River for instance, would result in many different species of fish and water species being caught and entangled in the gill nets. For this reason, gill netting often has negative connotations associated with it. Gill netting in Bristol Bay is a different situation. Our bycatch is extremely low, and the only thing I have caught other than salmon is flounder. Since the flounder is not gilled due to the shape of the fish, they are almost always, completely unofficial information here, alive and flipping when we find them in the nets, and they look no worse for wear. In my personal experience, I would estimate 99% of what we catch is salmon, and of that something percent that is not salmon is flounder. Of those flounder that we catch, over 95% are unharmed. I was originally unaware that gill netting could be a harmful process when I started fishing due to the extremely low bycatch that I was seeing on our fishing grounds in Alaska. I have only recently begun trying to figure out why the bycatch varies so much in different areas, so I am not educated enough to state why exactly. I think for Alaska's part, it has to do with the size of the mesh on the nets, cold and muddy, murky saltwater, and extremely large tide changes limiting what lives in the area to begin with. Now back to how we fish: drift net fishing versus set net fishing. Drift fishermen use larger boats, and are allowed to use much longer nets. In addition to this, the nets must be elevated to greater heights when they are being picked. These are all downsides, and here is why. Longer nets require large hydraulic rollers to pull the net into the boat, and during this process, the fish are often put under significant amounts of strain. The process of pulling the nets out of the water can also cause fish to come out of the net and be lost, most likely not alive if gilled for any significant amount of time. As I said before, the boats are larger, which gives them greater capacity. When fish are stored on the boats, there is often 1,000 pounds or more in one brailer bag. This weight causes the fish on the bottom to be crushed under the weight of the fish above it. The advantage to drift fishing boats is that they are starting to have refrigerated salt water tanks on board to chill down the fish and hopefully prevent the fish from being packed too tightly in the hold. This trend is in the right direction and will greatly improve the quality of salmon being exported out of Bristol Bay. Set net fishing, which Kwi-jak does, involves small boats often in shallow waters. We are the minority of fishermen up here. The allocation of salmon to be caught in our district is 16% for the Naknek-Kvichak district. This means simply that on average, 16% of the salmon caught in our district was caught by set net fishermen. Our boats use modern fuel-efficient 4-stroke outboard motors and consume minimal fuel. Set nets are just that, nets set, or anchored into the mud. Hydraulic rollers, if used at all, are smaller in nature, and rather than pulling the net into the boat is pulled along under the net as the fish are hand-picked from the net, often in shallow waters where currents are significantly less. This technique puts significantly less strain on the fish while it is in the net and allows for less loss of fish out of the net, and a greater recovery of fish in shallow waters that can be waded. At Kwi-jak, we limit our brailer weight. The The western part of Kenai Peninsula in south-central Alaska is bounded by Cook Inlet and the Kenai Mountains. Groundwater is the predominant source of water for commercial, industrial, and domestic uses on the peninsula. Mean daily water use in an oil, gas, and chemical processing area north of Kenai is more than 3.5 million gallons. Unconsolidated sediments of glacial and fluvial origin are the most productive aquifers. In the upper, northwestern, peninsula, almost all water used is withdrawn from unconsolidated sediments, which may be as thick as 750 feet. In the lower peninsula, unconsolidated sediments are thinner and are absent on many hills. Water supplies in the lower peninsula are obtained from unconsolidated sediments and bedrock, and the public water supply in parts of Homer is obtained from Bridge Creek. Throughout the peninsula, groundwater flow occurs primarily as localized flow controlled by permeability of aquifer materials and surface topography. The concentration of constituents analyzed in water from 312 wells indicated that the chemical quality of groundwater for human consumption varies from marginal to excellent. Even though the median concentration of dissolved solids is low, 152 mg per liter, much of the groundwater on the peninsula does not meet water quality regulations for public drinking water established by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, US EPA. About 8% of wells sampled yielded water having concentrations of dissolved arsenic that exceeded the US EPA primary maximum contaminant level of 50 micrograms per liter. Concentrations of dissolved arsenic were as great as 94 micrograms per liter. 46% of wells sampled yielded water having concentrations of dissolved iron greater than the US EPA secondary maximum contaminant level of 300 micrograms per liter. Unconsolidated sediments generally yield water having calcium. The Bristol Bay Management Area includes all coastal and inland waters east of a line from Cape Newnham to Cape Menchikoff, including 9 major river systems. Numerous freshwater nursery lakes and shallow estuaries make Bristol Bay the largest commercial sockeye salmon producing region in the world. The Bristol Bay area is divided into 5 management districts: Naknek-Kavichak, Agegik, Ogashik, Nishagik, and Togiak, corresponding to the major river drainages. The management objective for each river is to achieve spawning escapement goals while harvesting fish in excess of the goals through the drift and set gillnet fisheries. Additionally, Togiak District provides spawning grounds for the largest commercial Pacific herring fishery in Alaska. Captain of a 32-foot vessel in Bristol Bay, Alaska. With grueling 18-hour workdays and a lot of creative problem-solving, we are part of a small percentage of fishermen sustainably harvesting fish from the world's largest, completely wild, sockeye salmon run. My first season as a deckhand, I fell in love with it, who picked up the summer job in 2024 to keep her winters free for skiing and travel. I blinked, 7 years went by, and it was time for me to decide if I wanted to do something more traditional. I took a chance and bought into commercial fishing. Under the guidance of a boat broker, and with capital gleaned from her hard-earned savings account, Normando purchased a 1980 Bristol Bay gill netter, Layla M. When her boat launched this summer, she added her name to a short list of women boat captains in Alaska. Its operation utilizes gillnet fishing, aptly named to describe how the silver-coated fish wedge their way into mesh nets. The practice involves submerging a net that is 150 fathoms, or 900 feet long, into the water before using a hydraulic reel to pull the fish onto the boat deck. According to the World Wildlife Fund, the crystal clear waters of Bristol Bay produce about 46% of the globe's wild sockeye salmon harvest. The industry is highly regulated by Alaska's Department of Fish and Game and the United States Environmental Protection Agency to ensure the salmon population thrives for generations to come. We can't put our nets in the water until a certain amount of salmon have escaped upstream to spawn, and we have to adhere to strict guidelines on district boundaries and the hours in which we can fish, adding that she must keep the salmon in freezing water once on deck and is required to regularly transfer her catch to larger boats to take to shore so the fish stay fresh. A bright red fillet salmon laying on a boat deck near fillet knives and brown rubber fishing boots. When she's not navigating the shores of Bristol Bay or immersed in courses about diesel engines and hydraulic boat systems, the former art and art history and English double major is hitting the ski slopes and reflect of a healthy market, like a strong customer base, increased enthusiasm for fish and the lower forecast for Bristol Bay's upcoming sockeye season. But that isn't draining the excess stock fast enough. Bristol Bay produced at least £100 million more sockeye last season than the 6-year average, and fish were also shipped to other parts of the state for processing. Ex-vessel prices were about $100 million higher as well, which means more money for the fleet. But wholesale prices have dropped, between the surplus of fish and lower consumer spending due to inflation, and the rate at which sockeye are sold at market is actually slower than in 2021. I think the big question is, will they come back up? And if so, to what degree? Wink said. And I think a lot of that's going to have to do with how much of this pack isn't necessarily just sold to the first wholesale level, but how much of it is consumed and totally cleared out of the market. Meanwhile, costs have inflated for consumers, fishermen and processors. Higher interest rates kind of increases carrying costs, increases financing costs. Labor costs more, Wink said. Supply chain costs for shipping, for storage, especially, are up. Insurance is up quite a bit. It's not all bad news for the industry. While less salmon has sold as prices rose over the past year, Wink said sales trends are strong and sockeye is still a popular fish. The US dollar has also gotten weaker over the past 6 months, which is good for selling fish to other countries. And although last year's price per pound was down, Wink said the final ex-vessel value will likely be around $420 million thanks to the enormous volume of the catch. As for what fishermen may get paid this summer, Wink said there's no benefit to guessing, and he encouraged them to talk to their processors. The peak of Bristol Bay's sockeye salmon run has passed, and indications of the total catch will be lower than predicted. Across Alaska, 42.3 million salmon of all types have been landed as of the 13th of July, according to the Alaska Department of Fish and Game. In Bristol Bay, ADF&G forecasted a run of 51 million sockeye in the Bristol Bay watershed in 2023, which would have made it one of the best years ever in the bay. But initial catch figures are coming up short of projections. The first of the bay's fisheries opened at the beginning of June, and as of the 13th of July, the bay-wide run had reached 24.5 million sockeye. AFF&G fisheries biologist Tim Sands, who manages the Neshagik and Togiak district fisheries in the western part of Bristol Bay, said 13.9 million of an expected run of 16.3 million salmon had already returned to those two rivers. I'm hopeful the total run will be 15 million to 16 million, he told KLDG. Obviously, more than that would be great, but I think we'll be very close to forecasts. In the Neshagik, the total catch reached 9.5 million sockeye on Wednesday the 12th of July, but the run is winding down, according to Sands. Togiak has still not seen the bulk of its run come through, but Sands said it is also on track to meet its forecast. Early catches were strong across Bristol Bay, but dipped recently, according to the University of Washington Fisheries Research Institute data. There have been really big drop-offs that seem just odd, and persist for a day or 2 or 3. I've heard rumors there are some fish coming in now, so maybe we're having our last big push. We'll hopefully trickle in a couple 100,000 here and there for a week or so and see how that adds up. Despite the lower results, all rivers in Bristol Bay have reached their escapement goals, Sands said. And the sockeye that are returning are 1 year older and on average 1 pound heavier than previous years, he said, due to a large number of the salmon having spent an extra year at sea. However, fishermen aren't benefiting as much as they would from the fatter fish, as prices are down this year due to a glut caused by the record catch in 2022. We had really strong king salmon escapement in 2018, which was one of the main parent years for 2023, so I was optimistic. We're not sure why we're getting such poor production of kings. Something going on in the ocean. Obviously it's happening every